Hey everybody, I hope you're having a lovely day today. Welcome to Geneal Cymru. My name is Di, and here we talk about genealogy and Welsh history. If you're interested in any of that, there's a subscribe button at the bottom right of your screen. Today I'm going to talk about one pair of my 3 times great-grandparents. I wanted to start sharing my research findings, and I was inspired by one of the videos of the GeneaVlogger from last year, where he shares the stories of his 8 great-grandparents. A link to that video is in the description below. I'm starting with my 3 times great-grandparents because it's an interesting transitional period in my family history, as my ancestors moved from a small Welsh village in the countryside to an industrial town. It's a story of working-class tradespeople that you don't always get with the traditional narratives of history. And also I wanted to show what kind of Welsh family history stories you can get out of the records available online. So let's get into it. If you follow up my family tree, starting with me, my mum, my grampy, his father Thomas John Davies, his father Thomas Davies, and his parents are my 3 times great-grandparents, William Davies and Mary Thomas. William and Mary both come from the small village of Llandybie in the historic county of Carmarthenshire, Wales. William was born January or February of 1851. He was one of 9 children to Jacob Davies and Mary Morgan. About 2 months after he was born, on March 16, 1851, he was baptized in the local church of St. Tybie, after which the village is named. When he was a child, he lived with his family at White Mill, or Evelynwen, which was the mill that his father rented from the local Dynevor estate. By the time he was 10 years old, he went to live with his maternal uncle, Griffith Morgan, and his wife Elizabeth, in a nearby parish. Griffith trained him as a carpenter, and he became one of the first carpenters in the Davies family, who were largely blacksmiths and millers. By the time he was 20, he returned to his parents' home at White Mill and continued his work as a carpenter. And a couple years later, he and Mary get married. Mary Thomas was born in the first half of 1853 and was baptized on June 9th of that year in the same local church of St. Tybie's. She was one of 3 children that her mother, Esther Thomas, had. Esther was unmarried and in an abusive relationship with a local laborer, William Richards. William kept promising marriage to Esther. She would get pregnant and then he would run off. Mary's early life is a bit of a mystery to me, likely because of the stigma and relative poverty of having a single mother and being an illegitimate child. Mary, her mother, and her brothers moved around a lot. In 1861, the family home, Llandybie, wasn't even registered on the census, so it was likely uninhabited at the time, and Mary and her family were elsewhere. By 1871, her mother and brother were living at the family home, and Mary was off living elsewhere, working as a servant. Mary and William get married on January 11th, 1873, and at that time, Mary was working as a servant in Llandybie. For the duration of her marriage, Mary worked daily as a housewife. She tended to children, she carried out the household duties. She had no workers or servants to help her, so all of the work was done by her and with some support from the children. She probably learned to knit and make dresses from her mother, and by the time that the family started working at farming, like many of my other women ancestors on the farm, she probably attended to milking of the cows and other dairy work. Unfortunately, that kind of women's work wasn't reliably recorded in the census until the 1939 register, where it was normally recorded under unpaid household duties. In the early years of William and Mary's marriage, they continued living in Llandybie village. By 1881, they moved into William's late grandparents' house, Tŷ Gwyn Bach, or the Little White House in Llandybie village, and they lived there with their 2nd and 3rd children. Their first child was sent to live with William's maternal uncle, Griffith Morgan, who trained him also as a carpenter. That child, who was named Griffith Morgan Davies after his uncle, spent his whole life living on the farm with his aunt and uncle. While I haven't found adoption to be particularly common in the records for my family, in this case it wasn't abnormal. Griffith Morgan's wife, Elizabeth, was actually adopted as a young girl after her parents died, and the farm that they lived on was the farm worked by her adoptive parents. Sometime in 1881, before the birth of their fourth child, William and Mary leave their house in Llandybie. William's maternal cousin moves in with her family, and William and Mary move to a property called Pontlasse Cottage in Llandybie, in the historic county of Glamorganshire. Interestingly, this is not their first connection to Pontlasse. William's maternal cousin, William Morgan, got married in 1878 to a woman whose family lived at that Pontlasse cottage. So they likely moved to Pontlasse due to these family connections there. In Llandybie, William continued to work as a carpenter until sometime between 1901 and 1911, when he turned his focus to farming. William and Mary and some of their younger children moved to a house called Maeseglwys, which was down the road from Pontlasse and sat along the Llan River. In 1911, it was a house with 5 rooms, likely a kitchen, a common room, and 3 bedrooms. Decades before that, in 1841, there was the main house, 2 main outbuildings, and 2 smaller sheds on the property. That same house was still standing in 1962. The house had 2 stories, 3 chimneys, 1 in the center and 2 on either end. A rectangular floor plan with a front porch extending from the front and longer side. The front porch had an upper window, and itself was flanked on either side by 4 windows, 2 on the upper floor and 2 on the lower. The outer walls were painted with white plaster, and the house had a gray slate roof, and to one side of the house there was a large tree. A previous tenant farmer of Maeseglwys in 1893 went to court for breaking game hunting laws. Apparently, Maeseglwys was completely overrun by rabbits, and he claimed that there were 2,000 or 3,000 on his farm alone. He said he was killing them 20 to 30 a week. In the court case, he said, quote, "He was pestered with rabbits, and if he had not killed them hundreds of times, he would have been eaten up." Hopefully things calmed down by the time William and Mary moved in. At Maeseglwys, they cared for livestock and acres of farmland, where they grew clover, horse and meadow hay, white and black oats, wheat, barley, potatoes, and turnip. At the time of William's retirement from farming in 1919, they owned 21 cows, 4 pigs, and 8 horses. 2 of those horses were named Lation Hero and Havid Dre King. But by the time of his retirement, he put all of his livestock, crops, and farming implements up for sale. William and Mary had 10 children in total. The whole family was bilingual, and the children grew up speaking Welsh. But by 1901, they were all confidently bilingual in Welsh and English. And all of them, except for Griffith Morgan Davies, who grew up with his aunt and uncle, grew up in the Llandybie area. That area of Wales was highly industrialized at the time. An 1894-95 description of the area describes it as follows. Much of the land is naturally barren, and not a little has an aspect of extreme desolation. Copper, tinplate works, and collieries employ a large proportion of the inhabitants, and they greatly disfigure the landscape. The fluoric and arsenical acids from the copper works keep down the naturally poor vegetation. The heaps of slag are an eyesore, and the clouds of smoke from the numerous chimneys bedim the atmosphere. The industrial activity that was happening in Llandybie was tied into Wales's industrial boom that started in the late 1700s and continued into the 1900s. Being so close to Swansea, which was an important point in this industrial history and an important port town, the area drew migrant families like William and Mary's by the thousands, as they looked for different sorts of opportunities and ways to support their families. With the opportunities available in the area, their children were almost destined to grow up to work in that industrial landscape. All of their sons grew up to work as laborers or blacksmiths in the factories or laborers in mines. Most of their daughters married men who also worked in the factories and mines. And they all stayed in the area for most of their lives, except for one daughter who married a bookshop owner and moved to Pontypool in Monmouthshire. That kind of industrial work in the factories and the mines was dangerous work, and a trigger warning because I'm going to speak about two of their children who died very young. One of their children, David Owen Davies, was killed in 1907 at the Tierdoncan colliery, which was just down the road from their family home. There was a small mine collapse, which covered him and the cart that he was in with debris. They assumed that he was killed in the collapse, so they left him there for at least a day before they pulled his body out from under the debris. They later discovered that he was unharmed by the collapse, but suffocated due to them leaving him there. Another of their sons died similarly in the mines. As the rest of their children grew up and got married and moved into their own homes, William, now retired from farming, went to live with their son Dan Isaac Davies at his home in Forest Vach. He was eventually killed in 1930 after being hit by a motorcyclist. He was sat on a bench outside the pub on his way to collect rent from a property he owned, and he was knocked down by the motorcyclist. He died on December 6, 1930. In his will, he names his maternal cousin's son, Charles Llewellyn Morgan, as the executor of his will. Mary died sometime after 1928. But I haven't yet been able to figure out when that was. As of the day that I'm recording this audio, I actually received William Davis's will, and in it mentions that he's a member of two friendly societies, the Llandybie Lodge and the Llangyfelech Oddfellows Lodge. I don't know much at all about friendly societies, so my future research for William and Mary are going to take me into what those actually were all about. I think that there's some really important things that we can take away from the stories of Mary and William. And one of those being that our ancestors had lifelong relationships with other parts of their family. And it's not always easy to see in the records, but William had this long-lasting connection with his mother's family, the Morgans, and they were present all throughout his life, even though they didn't share a same surname. And that's why it's really important that we branch out our family history research as much as possible. The families of women are important. And I know that sometimes that gets lost with the way that we approach family trees. Another takeaway from this is that the places that our ancestors live have their own stories as well, and we can work to pull out that history and weave our ancestors' story into it. And the last takeaway that I want to highlight is that our ancestors' stories don't exist in isolation, but rather they're tied into these larger histories of industry, of migration. So when we look at those wider histories, we can often find hints as to why our ancestors made the decisions that they made. Why did our ancestors move? Why did our ancestors take on the occupations that they did? Why did our ancestors marry the people that they did? So that's my 3 times great-grandparents. Let me know in the comments if your ancestors had any of the similar stories. Were your ancestors migrants who were moving from a rural area to look for jobs in an industrial area? Have you discovered any really close relationships between your ancestors and another part of the family? Let me know in the comments. I would love to read them. If you'd like to see more genealogy or Welsh history videos, please make sure to hit the subscribe button. If you'd like to support this channel or get access to exclusive content, check out the Patreon and join the newsletter. You can also follow us on most platforms just by searching Geneal Cymru. Thanks for watching.